Good morning and welcome to The Global Current. I'm Karina Taylor.
And I'm Alex Krause.
In news this week,
the UN Climate Change Conference.
And the WFP suspends aid to Syrian refugees.
In analysis, the U.S. and China reach an agreement on carbon emissions.
And Palestine's growing recognition within the EU.
And special coverage of Nobel laureate Leyma Gbowee's discussion of women's role in the Ebola crisis and the value of communities in global issues.
Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the show.
And now, Karina Hendren reports on the ongoing UN Climate Change Conference in Peru.
This past September, millions of people around the world marched to raise awareness to climate change. The Wall Street Journal reports that officials will meet at the 20th Conference of the Parties over the course of the next 2 weeks in Lima, Peru. According to Peruvian government officials, over 3,000 negotiators and 7,000 other interested personnel will attend the conference, which starts on December 12th. This meeting follows recent negotiations between the United States and China regarding carbon emissions reductions. Experts such as Michael Oppenheimer, professor of geosciences and international affairs at Princeton University, and a member of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, state that the agreement made by President Obama and President Xi Jinping was encouraging. The EU has also taken a firm stance on lowering emissions. According to the European Commission website, the EU is aiming for a 40% domestic greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. According to Roberto Benatti, a spokesperson for the Lima COP20, the talks in Lima will create momentum for a climate change pact that the world leaders will sign in Paris at the end of 2015. It remains to be seen how many countries will sign the pact. The BBC reports that Canada, Australia, Japan, Russia, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, and other countries have not made firm commitments to emission reduction goals. Despite the optimism of talks in Lima and Paris, scientific research has yielded disparaging findings about planetary climate change. According to the New York Times, many scientists are convinced that an increase in the Earth's atmosphere of 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit could result in disastrous flooding, droughts, and glacial shrinkage. The article goes on to cite reports claiming that the temperature will rise before the new emissions reduction deals can be implemented. Also, a point of discussion at the COP20 are concerns over rising global temperatures. The BBC cites studies by the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration claiming that the average global atmospheric temperature from January to October is the hottest since the year 1880, the year recording began. In light of these facts, the UN climate chief Christiana Figueres says 2014 is threatening to be the hottest year in history and emissions continue to rise. We need to act urgently. This is Karina Hendren for The Global Current.
Emily Levaday reports on the World Food Programme's recent decision to suspend aid to Syrian refugees.
1.6 million Syrian refugees have lost aid from the World Food Programme due to a lack of funding. The WFP is a branch of the UN who has been providing refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt with vouchers to purchase food. Without these vouchers, many will go hungry in the winter. The WFP is dependent upon donations, and according to the Daily Star, pledgers have not been following through on their contributions. No information has been released on which countries have not been following through on their pledges. Consequently, the WFP needs to raise $64 million to continue providing aid to the Syrian refugees. On Monday, this decision was made to pull aid until adequate funds were raised. According to the BBC, the WFP is not the only agency struggling with funding. Several other agencies have suffered from underfunding and have been striving to target only the most impoverished refugees. The Daily Star has announced that on Wednesday, the WFP has launched a campaign begging for donations. In response, Germany, Finland, and Sweden told reporters in Copenhagen that they could do more to fund the WFP. In the meantime, the WFP makes its crisis evident as it scrambles for money to prevent refugees from starving this winter. Visiting their website, WFP.org, the Syrian crisis is clearly highlighted, followed by a link labeled Donate Now in large letters.
We thank you for your continued support to WFP's work to ensure that those who are the victims of the lack of a political solution can continue to find that WFP and the partners that we work with can provide the food assistance that they and their children need during this terrible ongoing crisis. Thank you.
The WFP has reported that failure to provide vouchers to refugees in camps, particularly in Lebanon and Jordan, could be, quote, devastating. Since the uprising against Bashar al-Assad began 3 years ago, a reported 3.2 million people have fled Syria, and another 7.6 million have been internally displaced. BBC reporter Jim Weir says that due to the suspended funding, refugees will be even less welcomed in countries like Lebanon, who has taken in 1.1 million refugees since the beginning of the conflict. This is Emily Livaday for The Global Current.
Ryan Sullivan analyzes a new breakthrough in U.S.-China carbon emission standards.
Last month, big steps were taken in establishing the groundwork for potential international legislation on combating climate change. The world's largest emitters of carbon dioxide, China and the United States, met on November 12th in Beijing and agreed upon an ambitious deal to reduce their emission levels. At the core of this deal are two major, yet separate, targets specific to the United States and China respectively. The United States is looking to cut its levels of carbon emissions from its 2005 levels by 26 to 28%. China is aiming to peak its carbon emissions by 2030, while also producing 20% of its energy from zero carbon emission sources by that same year. To reach both of these goals, these countries will have to divert large amounts of resources from current projects and policies, orienting the focus on low-level carbon emitters and carbon-free projects. The president of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, called for an energy revolution in China in order to achieve such an ambitious goal with this deal. The call for countries to act has established a greater voice in recent years. Just this past September, over 400,000 global citizens marched the streets of New York City as world leaders gathered at the United Nations for a summit on climate change. The demonstrations included an estimated 50,000 college students, 1,574 organizations, and over 630,000 social media posts. The growing push for action from all sectors of society is compelling the political leaders all over the world to develop and deliver policies on climate change. David Holmes, a researcher at Monash University in Australia, spoke to CNN. He stated that the announcement may mean climate will have to be higher on the G20 agenda, despite host nation Australia trying to keep it off altogether. This is a very important point. The fact that these two giant nations in particular have stepped into the ring to battle climate change means that now every major international conference will have to include the climate issue in its discussion. The influence and imminence that China and the United States bring to this matter is especially significant. For too long, no matter how much energy and attention the small nations of Western Europe put into the global climate issue, it has seemed that the continuing growth of the U.S. and China's unprecedented emission levels overshadowed these efforts. The deal acts as a starter gun for these two nations to invest more resources into the development and research that is needed to achieve these goals in the established time frame. One major issue, however, threatens the success of this deal, and it lies in the United States' domestic political arena. Members of both the Republican and Democratic Party have many questions and concerns on the current scientific data in regards to climate change. In the U.S. political system, the President's administration cannot implement its own policies without the overview and consent of Congress, which is a systematic difference compared to the political structure of China. Yet, internationally, treaties need to be implemented by its domestic politicians. A global issue that affects every individual of every country has to be addressed by the political sector in the United States for any meaningful action to take place globally. One development that may bring hope for those involved in the call to action on climate change is the recent rejection of the proposed Keystone Pipeline that underwent defeat in the U.S. Senate. It is crucial that the U.S. and China ensure implementation of these climate change policies above other domestic policies influenced by opposing forces. This way, the two largest carbon emitters can be leaders in the research and application of alternative fuels for developed and developing countries alike. The world now looks forward to a highly anticipated summit in Paris next fall at the United Nations Climate Conference. The hope is that a strong and encompassing piece of legislation can be signed and ratified at the summit, situating all countries on a path towards combating climate change. This is Evan Doolittle reporting for Ryan Sullivan for The Global Current.
Blythe Brady discusses the status of Palestine in light of recent recognition from major EU members.
This past summer witnessed increased violence in Gaza between the Israeli forces and the Palestinians, a 50-day bombardment which saw Israelis launch attacks within the Palestinian territory against Hamas, a group sometimes labeled a terrorist organization, sometimes a resistance movement, against Israeli encroachment. Following the ceasefire in August, Israel and the Palestinians have been attempting to rebuild their respective communities following what had been an enormously destructive war. Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, visited Gaza 2 months ago, and he spoke of destruction, quote, beyond description, unquote, according to the New York Times. He went on to say, quote, no amount of Security Council sessions, reports, or briefings could have prepared me for what I witnessed today, unquote. Building materials from Israel have been slowly arriving, which Mr. Ban also criticized, saying, quote, the mindless pattern of blockades, rockets, and destruction must stop, unquote. Against this backdrop came winds of change within the attitudes of the European Union member states, as one after another passed motions to formally recognize Palestine as an independent state. Sweden announced its formal recognition of the Palestinian state as separate from Israel, followed shortly by a symbolic vote within the United Kingdom's House of Commons to recognize Palestine. Most recently, Spain adopted a symbolic motion last month, and France this past Wednesday, formally recognizing the state of Palestine. Sweden's recent national elections ushered in a new center-left government, which stands ready to make waves in the international arena, as its newly elected Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, announced his government's intention to formally recognize the state of Palestine. This made Sweden the first long-term member nation in the European Union to do so. In September, Sweden's population shifted away from the center-right coalition, which had been in power for 8 years, shifting power to the Social Democrats, who built a coalition with other left-leaning parties. Mr. Löfven stated 2 months ago that, quote, a two-state solution requires mutual recognition and a will to peaceful coexistence, unquote, reports the BBC. Sweden formally recognized the Palestinian state at the end of October, boosting international support for the economically struggling Palestine. This move is, of course, controversial. This recognition is meant to reflect the situation as it is on the ground, where Israel and Palestine are two separate states. The recognition of a Palestinian state by Sweden does not mean Sweden no longer recognizes Israel. On the contrary, many commentators believe that formal recognition of both Palestine and Israel would contribute to the ongoing peace process. The most widely accepted system for peace in the region revolves around a two-state solution. Thus, acknowledging a two-state reality could help promote peace because it would give both sides equal bargaining positions as states. It also follows a wave of anti-Israeli sentiment in Europe in light of the recent Gaza war. Boycotts of goods produced by Israeli companies that operated in the West Bank, a Palestinian territory, gained momentum in Europe in light of this summer's conflict between Israel and Hamas, particularly due to the high level of reported civilian casualties, reports the New York Times. It is also important to note that Sweden, the United Kingdom, Spain, and now France are not the first states to make the move to recognize Palestine, and not even the first nations within the EU to do so. Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia all recognize the state of Palestine. However, the recognition came before these three nations joined the European Union. The other 23 states in the Union have refrained from officially recognizing Palestinian statehood, according to the BBC. There are a total of 130 nations in the world that recognize the Palestinian state, including much of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Even the United States, which has played a mediator role between Israel and the Palestinians, has not recognized Palestine as a state. In fact, the State Department spokeswoman, Jen Psaki, called Sweden's move, quote, premature, unquote, reports the Times of Israel. Western nations have largely refrained from formally recognizing a Palestinian state, which made the recent events all the more surprising as 4 major member states of the European Union made moves to show their support for the Palestinians. The United Kingdom's House of Commons voted 2 months ago in a symbolic manner to lend their support to the recognition of Palestine as an independent state. This vote will have no effect on Britain's governmental position, however, and is meant solely to act as a gesture towards the Palestinians. The motion, which passed 274 votes to 12, stated, quote, that this House believes that the government should recognize the state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel as a contribution to securing a negotiated two-state solution, unquote, reports Al Jazeera. While this vote will have no effect on the foreign policy of the UK, It is seen as a move that could give momentum to the Palestinians as they hope to put a resolution before the UN Security Council to set a deadline for Israel to exit, quote, occupied lands, unquote, of Palestine. In order to have such a resolution reach the floor, it would need a majority vote within the Security Council. The Palestinian campaign remains 2 votes short of the needed majority, reports ABC News. Whether this resolution is able to gain enough votes to enter the debate remains unknown. However, the recent moves by France, Spain, Sweden, and the United Kingdom to recognize Palestine as a state offers hope to the Palestinian people and shines a spotlight on the ongoing issue, which will help raise awareness in the international community and possibly help to restart the stalled peace process between Israel and Palestine. Reporting for the Global Current, this is Blythe Brady.
And now, we bring you Nobel laureate Leyma Gbowee's thoughts on the importance of women and community in containing the Ebola crisis and other world conflicts.
On November 20th, the Seton Hall School of Diplomacy's World Leaders Forum hosted Leyma Gbowee, the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Gbowee joins a lineup of former heads of state such as Mikhail Gorbachev and Tony Blair, and UN Secretaries General Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon. The event was held in a large auditorium filled with students, faculty, alumni, and the general public. The Nobel Peace Prize laureate was greeted by Dean Bartoli of the School of Diplomacy. Leyma Gbowee's lecture was titled The Butterfly Effect: Local Actions Informing Global Causes, in which she speaks on local action and leadership. As she began her remarks, Gbowee stated that she was not a normal person. Quote, "Normal today includes killing and war. Crazy is daring to do good and wage peace. I'd rather be crazy." After the subsequent applause, Gbowee recounted her memories during the beginning of the Liberian Civil War. From her experiences in managing the hardship of life in war, Gbowee began her fight alongside women that would contribute to the consolidation of peace in Liberia. The international community treated the situation as one that needed intervention, and women were seen as victims. Despite this view, Gbowee believed that the local actions of Liberian women would make a difference in the situation. Gbowee said, quote, "Women in Africa need no ideas. They have it. Resources are the problem." Yet, even with the lack of resources, she was able to mobilize and lead a large women's peace movement despite the danger of Yet, even with the lack of resources, she was able to mobilize and lead a large women's peace movement despite the danger involved with her line of work and the status of women. As a grassroots organizer and worker for peace, her successes are something that should be greatly appreciated. However, she did mention that people fail to heed the need for local action. Some local action is not listened to by the global community, and global responses sometimes disregard local action. As a result, the butterfly effect starting from an uninformed global response is a backlash to the community. An example she used was the placement of hand pumps in the middle of a village. Prior to that, women would traditionally walk for more than a mile to collect water. On the way to get the water, they shared their problems. On the way back, they devised solutions. The placement of the hand pump removed that walk, and the discussion and solution making. And as a result, Gbowee noted, many women turned to alcohol to cope with their situations. Her successes in the events of the Liberian Civil War has made her a strong advocate for peace and women, not only for Africa but the world. Even after the Civil War, Gbowee is still an advocate for peace. As someone who has always fought for peace, no one else could have said it any better. Peace is a process, not an event. In a press conference with the university media, Gbowee provided insight into her thoughts on the various situations in Liberia. On matters like Ebola, Gbowee made her views very well known. On President Obama's decision to act on the spread of Ebola, Ms. Gbowee had this to say.
And the misconception and misinformation within this country about the virus, I would say he did a brave thing when everyone else globally was still playing around. Was it early, a little bit too late? Because this virus had been raging since March. Do I blame him? No, because our own governments in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea are to be blamed. They were not interested until senior government officials begin to get infected with the virus. Then they got interested in trying to stop the virus.
On the subject of the U.S. military medical mission, Gbowee expressed,
I would say we're grateful as a Liberian for the help. However, and I'm sure you were waiting for that however part, I would have loved to see the US government put their money into upgrading our health infrastructure instead of putting military tent hospital. The $25 million tent hospital is a waste of money, especially in a place like Liberia where we have almost no health infrastructure. Bringing 3,000 troops on the ground just to help with logistics is also a waste of money, because Liberia and the Ebola crisis did not need military men. We needed healthcare practitioners, all funding going to local health groups.
She gave an example of the ELWA hospital located in Monrovia and how the patients there called it hell due to the lack of equipment and investment, while the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital had all the best resources. When asked about what the government should do in terms of investment in health infrastructure, Gbowee pointed out the disinterest of the government.
Prior to the outbreak of the Ebola crisis, we had maintained that our government was not interested in providing basic social services for people. Our education system is a total mess. Our healthcare system is in shambles. And I think right now our government needs to focus on it. Everyone keeps saying the Ebola virus is going down. It's true. But why? We've hit the dry season in Liberia. The sun is doing well for us. The question is, come May next year, when we go back to the rain, will we see a recurrence of the virus? The answer is yes, if we do not start to tackle those basic healthcare issues. So it's not like the temporary ETUs, the emergency treatment units that they have up, but really just investing in making sure that the hospitals are equipped and also that healthcare workers are taken care of. In the midst of the virus, when people were sacrificing and healthcare workers were dying, there was no reason why our government could not provide salaries for them. You read in papers where they were striking because they couldn't get their pay on time. So those are some of the basic things that the government needs to do in order to ensure that we do not have a recurrence of the virus or another public health crisis.
In regards to local action on the epidemic, Gbowee pointed out local sensitization. First, she showed the lack of confidence in the government and in having the Liberian people's trust.
It's unfortunate. Lack of confidence in our government really can be attributed to the spread of the virus. Once they said we have Ebola, people went on the radio to say no, it's not true. The government is tricking the international community to steal donors' money. So there's high rates of corruption versus lack of confidence in the ability of the government to tell people the truth led to the spread. And then as a government, there was nothing that was done. They did not have any information sensitization plan, none whatsoever.
Next, Gbowee highlighted the local solutions which help educate the Liberian people.
I spent the first 3 weeks of July in Monrovia when the virus was spreading. And it was at that time that we decided, along with some other groups, let's change our plan. Let's focus on sensitization because people were not taking cues. So it became word of mouth, it became radio messages, voice over. So they looked for prominent Liberians, myself, George Weah, some other people to say Ebola is real, don't take this for a joke.
Gbowee, on the issues of women and children, talked about how the current situation with the Ebola virus has festered problems for them.
And one of the things that made it so easy for us to know that we had a serious health crisis were the number of pregnant women who were being rejected as they were in labor to give birth. And families now had to weigh saving the child's life versus saving the woman's life. And most of those families who were able to have babies delivered dead and the wives staying alive were saying, thank God, at least we have our wife. No one should have to choose between two human beings.
Gbowee also said that many households in Liberia are seeing a rise of teenagers as the heads of household, because in many cases both parents have died from the virus, and it is mostly up to the girls to keep these families functioning. Gbowee warned of what the situation can become for young girls.
Another thing that we'll see if we don't put the structures in place would be very young girls turning to prostitution to help take care of their siblings. So these are things, how do we handle it?
On the bright side of this, Gbowee mentioned the importance of local groups.
To take care of these children. And people came and said, oh, let's give them to an orphanage. And the grandfather was like, no, and the women in the community was like, no. So you have women who also lost all their children to the virus. So they are finding ways of pairing these children with those women so that they're right in the community, there's community support, and they can continue to take care of them.
Gbowee, a mother of 6, is currently providing for 8 children back in Liberia. However, she noted, local actions can only go so far.
Unfortunately, the problem with local responses, they lack the resources. But at the local level, people were really doing it. Even till today, people are still doing their best to make sure that this thing, because local people lives are tied to this. You know, it's not a day's job. It's survival.
Another issue she talked about was the role of women in the economy and how they have been ignored in West Africa.
You have countries that have data on their economy that never takes into consideration the local market women. They never take into consideration those women who are providing home care. They never take any of those into consideration as contribution to the economy. And until we continue to see the growth of a country's economy from this level and never down there, we continue to have these problems. Because at the local level, what people do is the core of caregiving, is the core of the economy. So I think it's time to start to rethink. And I think in some places they're rethinking how these things are done, how people are documenting, you know, the economy of different countries and how it can be. And I think once you start, then you now start to say, what kind of social services can we put in place for this category of people? But basically in Africa and other parts, third world countries, you really don't have that.
In another issue, Gbowee talked on leadership. She learned throughout her experiences this important lesson.
It's never about you. So as a leader, if there's a decision to take, it's never about you. If there are choices to make, it's not about you. It's about the people that you lead.
She described her experience in leading some 2,500 women to the office of Charles Taylor, the Liberian president during the Civil War. She was one of 10 allowed to meet the president, and she had the ability to take a stand and have him appear before the women.
But by the time I turn around and look at those group of women sitting down there, that was not the plan. That was not why we came. We came because they wanted to see him, they wanted to hear from him. Not 10 persons, but all of us. So I angrily said to his bodyguard, I'm going to tell him to come downstairs or we will not have that meeting. Eventually he decided to come down. But the point that I'm making is that at that moment, it was not me because I had access. It was about those women who had come. And a lot of them had been through situations that I had not been through. So I needed for them to hear, to feel, to see, you know, what was needed, and it meant a lot to them.
She also had this to say about leaders in general.
The leader will be hated by everyone, but the leader must love everyone. See, everyone is not forced to love the leader, but the leader is forced to love everyone. Everyone is not forced to work with the leader, but the leader is forced to work with everyone. So once you have that understanding, is it an easy thing to do? Every morning you have to put on a double layer of skin, you know, to be able to take it with a pinch of salt. But then once you start, it's a beautiful thing because people will go with you wherever because they've seen that sense of selflessness, they've seen that you sincerely care about them.
Gbowee's experiences in and insights on these issues provide perfect examples of how and why local action is important and how it can affect global responses to the problems that affect our world. This is Daniel Garay for The Global Current.
Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of The Global Current. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and be sure to visit us on blogs.shu.edu/globalcurrent. I'm Karina Taylor.
And I'm Alex Krause.
And we'll see you next week.